The man in the front row stood up slowly, buttoned his jacket, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're singing at my daughter's wedding next Saturday, or you're not singing anywhere ever again." Notice Dean didn't flinch, didn't miss a beat, didn't even stop smiling. What he did in the next 45 seconds would become the most legendary moment in Vegas history, and the reason that man never threatened another performer again. The Silver Palace had been running at full capacity for 6 straight weeks, the kind of legendary residency that only happened once or twice in a generation, the kind that other performers talked about with a mixture of admiration and barely concealed envy. Every seat filled, every table booked weeks in advance, every night another sellout crowd of tourists and high rollers and movie stars who had flown in from Hollywood just to say they'd seen Dean Martin live. The champagne was flowing freely, the cigarette smoke hung in the air like expensive French perfume, and Dean was 3 songs into his second set, feeling that particular magic that only happens when a performer and an audience are perfectly in sync. Then everything changed in the space of a single breath, in the time it takes for a heart to beat once. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? Because this story is about to show you what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, and the immovable object happens to be holding a microphone and wearing a tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars. The man who stood up was named Carmine Falcone, though Dean wouldn't learn that name until later, after the police reports were filed and the newspapers got hold of the story and ran it on the front page with headlines that screamed about showdowns and confrontations. He was old Vegas money, the kind of man who had helped build this city from desert sand and broken dreams back when the Strip was nothing but tumbleweeds and ambition, the kind whose name was spoken in whispers even by people who had never met him face to face. He controlled unions, construction contracts, liquor distribution, and half the entertainment venues on the Strip. When Carmine Falcone wanted something, he got it. There were no exceptions, no negotiations, no second chances. When he made a threat, people listened because the alternative was unthinkable. And right now, he was standing in the front row of the Silver Palace, his custom Italian suit catching the light, making a threat that 400 people could hear clearly, despite the fact that he hadn't raised his voice at all. The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence between songs, not the respectful quiet of an audience waiting for the next number, but something heavier, darker, more suffocating, the kind of silence that falls when everyone in a room suddenly realizes they might be witnessing something dangerous, something that could end in blood and screaming and tomorrow's headlines. Waitresses froze mid-step, their trays of drinks suspended in the air, as if gravity itself had paused to watch. Bartenders stopped pouring, bottles hovering over glasses that would never be filled. Even the cigarette smoke seemed to hang motionless in the air, waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see if this would be the night that Dean Martin's legendary charm finally met its match. Dean had been around long enough to know exactly who Carmine Falcone was, and what he was capable of doing to people who crossed him. He knew the stories that circulated in dressing rooms and hotel bars, the rumors that passed between performers in hushed voices, the whispered warnings that every entertainer heard when they first started working Vegas. Don't cross the families. Don't refuse their requests, no matter how unreasonable. Don't ever embarrass them in public, because the men who run this city have long memories and short tempers. The smart play was obvious to anyone with half a brain. Smile, nod, agree to sing at the wedding, and sort out the details later, with lawyers and managers and people who got paid to handle these kinds of situations. It's what any reasonable person would do. It's what every other performer in Las Vegas would have done, without a moment's hesitation, grateful just to walk away with their career and their kneecaps intact. But Dean Martin had never been particularly reasonable. And he certainly wasn't about to start now. Listen, what happened in the next 45 seconds would be talked about in every casino, every showroom, every backroom poker game in Nevada, For the next 30 years, it would become the story that performers told each other when they needed courage before stepping onto a stage, the legend that separated the good entertainers from the truly great ones, the moment that proved beyond any doubt that Dean Martin was something more than just a singer with a smooth voice and a charming smile. It would become proof that some people are born with a kind of fearlessness that can't be taught, can't be faked, can't be broken even when facing down the most dangerous man in the city. He kept the microphone at his lips, steady as a surgeon's hand. He kept that easy smile on his face, the one that had charmed audiences from New York to Los Angeles and everywhere in between. And instead of agreeing, instead of backing down, instead of doing the smart and safe thing that everyone in that room expected him to do, he laughed. Not a nervous laugh that would have signaled weakness, not a forced chuckle designed to diffuse tension, a real, genuine from-the-belly laugh that filled the silent room like a thunderclap and seemed to push back against Carmine's threat, like a physical force, like a wall of sound that refused to yield. 400 people held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests, waiting to see how Carmine Falcone would react to being laughed at in public for perhaps the first time in his 63 years of life on this earth. "Paulus," Dean said, his voice carrying across the room with that effortless projection that only comes from decades of performing. "I appreciate the invitation. Really, I do. But I've got to ask, does your daughter know you're out here threatening singers on a Saturday night? Because if my old man tried to book my wedding entertainment by scaring people in nightclubs, my mother would have had his head on a platter." Wait. The room didn't know how to react to what they were witnessing. Some people laughed nervously, unsure if this was somehow part of the show, some elaborate bit that Dean had cooked up with a planted audience member for their entertainment. Others sat frozen in their seats like statues, watching Carmine's face with the intensity of people who knew they might be witnessing the last few minutes of a man's career, or worse. The two men at Carmine's table, bodyguards, almost certainly, with the thick necks and dead eyes that marked their profession, had risen slightly from their seats, their hands moving toward their jackets, in that unmistakable way that suggested they were carrying something considerably heavier than wallets and cigarette cases. But something strange was happening to Carmine Falcone's face, something that nobody in that room had expected to see. The cold fury that had been there moments before, the look that had made grown men weep and beg for mercy, was shifting, changing, transforming into something else entirely. He was trying not to smile, and he was failing. "You've got some nerve," Carmine said. But there was a crack in his voice now, a hint of something that might have been amusement fighting to break through the tough guy exterior. "Nobody talks to me like that. Nobody." "Well, somebody should," Dean shot back, still grinning, because that entrance? Terrible. Standing up in the middle of a song, making threats, scaring all these nice people who just came out to have a good time? That's not how you ask someone to sing at a wedding. That's how you get banned from restaurants. Stop for a second and picture this scene from above, because the geometry of what happened next only makes sense when you understand where everyone was positioned. Dean at center stage, microphone in hand, spotlight making him glow like something not quite of this world. Carmine Falcone, standing in the front row, surrounded by empty space as the people at neighboring tables had instinctively leaned away from him. Two bodyguards half risen from their seats, hands inside their jackets, waiting for orders, and 400 people scattered throughout the room, watching the most dangerous man in Las Vegas get publicly dressed down by a crooner in a tuxedo. "You want to know how you ask someone to sing at your daughter's wedding?" Dean continued, walking to the edge of the stage, getting closer to Carmine instead of farther away. "You send a nice letter. You have your people call my people. You maybe include a bottle of good scotch, because I'm a man of simple pleasures. What you don't do is stand up in the middle of my show and threaten my career in front of 400 witnesses. That's just rude. Remember, Dean was walking a razor's edge with every word that came out of his mouth, and he knew it. Every joke was a gamble with his life, as the stakes. Every casual gesture, a roll of the dice that could come up snake eyes. Carmine Falcone had killed men for smaller insults than this. Everyone in Vegas knew the stories. He had destroyed careers with a single phone call, bankrupted businesses that had taken generations to build, made people disappear so completely that even their families eventually stopped looking. The smart money said Dean Martin was about to join the long list of people who had underestimated Carmine Falcone and paid the ultimate price for their arrogance. But Dean had seen something that nobody else in the room could see. Something that his years of reading audiences had trained him to notice. He had caught that flicker of almost smile on Carmine's face. That crack in the armor, that hint of humanity beneath the monster's mask. And he was betting everything, his career, his safety, possibly his life, on the gamble that Carmine Falcone was tired of being feared and might actually enjoy, for once in his miserable life, being challenged by someone who wasn't afraid to look him in the eye. "You know what your problem is," Dean said, now standing at the very edge of the stage, close enough that he could have reached out and touched Carmine's shoulder. "You're used to everyone saying yes to you. Every waiter, every doorman, every businessman in this city falls all over themselves to make you happy. And that's got to be exhausting. Nobody ever tells you the truth. Nobody ever pushes back. So when your daughter's wedding comes around and you want it to be perfect, you don't know how to ask for help. You only know how to demand." The room was absolutely still. Even the bodyguards had frozen, waiting to see how this would play out, their hands still inside their jackets, but no longer moving toward whatever weapons were hidden there. Carmine Falcone stared at Dean Martin for a long moment. His face was unreadable, a poker player's mask that had been perfected over decades of high-stakes games where the stakes were measured in lives, not chips. Then he did something that nobody expected. He sat down, not defeated, not humiliated, but thoughtfully, like a man who had just heard something worth considering. He gestured to his bodyguards, and they relaxed back into their seats. He picked up his drink, scotch, Dean noticed, expensive, and took a slow sip. "All right, Martin," Carmine said. And now there was definitely a smile trying to break through. "I'm listening." How should I have asked? Listen. This was the moment where everything could still go wrong, where the whole delicate balance could tip into disaster. Dean had won the first round through sheer audacity, but Carmine Falcone wasn't the kind of man who lost gracefully, wasn't the kind who let perceived slights go unpunished. One wrong word, one perceived insult that cut too deep, and the whole situation could flip in an instant. The bodyguards were still there, still watching, still ready to act. The threat was still real, still hanging in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Dean was standing on a stage in front of 400 witnesses, but witnesses had a way of forgetting things when Carmine Falcone was involved. Witnesses developed sudden cases of amnesia. Witnesses moved to other cities. Witnesses occasionally stopped being witnesses altogether. Dean smiled. Not his performance smile, not the charming grin he used to sell tickets and records, but something more genuine, more real, the smile of a man who recognizes a kindred spirit hiding behind a mask of intimidation and fear. "First," he said, "you wait until after the show. A man's got his professional pride, and interrupting mid-song is just bad manners. Second, you buy me a drink, not because you have to, but because that's how civilized people start conversations. Third, you tell me about your daughter. What's her name? What kind of music does she like? Is she marrying a good man? Or do I need to sing sad songs all night?" The tension in the room was beginning to break like ice cracking on a spring lake. People were starting to breathe again, starting to shift in their seats, starting to exchange glances with their companions that said, "Are we really watching this happen? Did Dean Martin really just do what we think he did?" Carmine leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. Her name is Isabella. She likes the old songs, Sinatra, Como, all those guys from the old neighborhood. And the man she's marrying." He paused, and for just a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his weathered face, something that looked almost like fear. "He's a good man, better than she deserves probably, better than I deserve for a son-in-law. After everything I've done in my life." "Then it sounds like a wedding worth singing at," Dean said. "And I'll tell you what, since you asked so nicely the second time around, I'll even do it for free. Consider it a wedding gift." "Wait." The room erupted in a way that nobody could have predicted. Not in applause, exactly, but in that release of tension that comes when you've been holding your breath for too long and your lungs are screaming for air and you finally remember to exhale. Laughter bubbled up from tables throughout the room. Surprised exclamations echoed off the walls. The sound of 400 people simultaneously realizing that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that would become a legend, something they would tell their children and grandchildren about for decades to come. Carmine Falcone stood up again, but this time there was no threat in his posture, no menace in his movements. He walked to the edge of the stage with the careful dignity of a man who knows he has lost, but refuses to be humiliated, and extended his hand toward Dean with a respect that surprised everyone who saw it, including, perhaps, Carmine himself. "You've got guts, Martin. Real guts. I respect that more than you know. Nobody's talked to me like that in 20 years, maybe longer." Dean shook his hand firmly, meeting his eyes without flinching. "Then you've been surrounded by the wrong people for 20 years. A man needs friends who'll tell him when he's being an idiot. Otherwise, how's he supposed to know? You volunteering for the job? I'm volunteering to sing at your daughter's wedding. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." The handshake lasted a moment longer than necessary. The kind of grip that seals deals and ends feuds and begins friendships that nobody saw coming. It was the handshake of two men who recognized something in each other, something that went beyond their different worlds and different lives. Then Carmine returned to his seat with a dignity that his bodyguards had rarely seen, and Dean turned back to face the audience with the easy grin of a man who had just won the biggest gamble of his life. "So where were we before we got interrupted by the floor show? Oh right, I was about to sing a love song. Seems appropriate now, doesn't it? Nothing like a little threat of violence to put romance in the air." The band kicked in with practiced professionalism, picking up the cue without missing a beat. Dean launched into "That's Amore," his voice rich and warm and completely steady, and the Silver Palace transformed back into what it was supposed to be, a place where people came to forget their troubles, to drink expensive champagne, to watch a master performer do what he did better than anyone else in the entire world. But something had changed in that room, something fundamental that couldn't be undone. The energy was different now, electric, charged with the knowledge that everyone present had just witnessed something they would tell their grandchildren about. The night Dean Martin stood up to Carmine Falcone and lived to sing about it. The night a crooner in a tuxedo proved that courage sometimes matters more than power. Hold this moment in your mind, because what happened in the weeks after that night would prove that Dean's gamble had paid off in ways he never expected. The wedding was the following Saturday, held at Carmine's estate outside the city, a sprawling compound that most people only saw from a distance. Dean arrived with just his pianist, expecting a quick performance and a quiet exit. What he found was something else entirely. Isabella Falcone was beautiful. Dark hair, bright eyes, a smile that suggested she had inherited her father's stubbornness along with his money. Her groom, a young attorney named Michael DeSantis, seemed genuinely terrified to be surrounded by so many people whose names appeared in FBI files. But when he looked at Isabella, that terror disappeared, replaced by something that made Dean's cynical heart feel just a little bit lighter. "Mr. Martin," Isabella said, approaching him before the ceremony, "I want to thank you for singing It's my pleasure, really. Not for singing. She glanced toward her father, who was across the room, trying to look dignified, while his wife adjusted his tie for the third time. For what you did last week at the Silver Palace. Dean raised an eyebrow. You heard about that? Everyone heard about it. And I've never seen my father laugh so hard. He came home that night and told my mother the whole story, acting out both parts. He said you were the first person in 30 years to treat him like a human being instead of a monster. Notice, the words hit Dean harder than he expected, landing somewhere deep in his chest, where he kept the things that really mattered. He had spent so much energy that night reading Carmine, trying to find the crack in his armor, calculating his every word and gesture for maximum effect, that he hadn't stopped to think about what it might mean to actually find that crack, to actually reach the human being hiding behind the monster's mask. Carmine Falcone wasn't just a mob boss, a threat, a danger to be neutralized through charm and quick thinking. He was a father, worried about his daughter's wedding day and whether she would be happy. He was a husband, getting his tie adjusted by a wife who clearly still loved him after all these years of blood and violence. He was a man who had been feared for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be liked, to be respected for something other than his capacity for destruction. Your father's not a bad man, Dean said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of a surgeon. He's just been in a bad business for a long time. It changes people, hardens them, makes them forget who they used to be. He is a bad man, Isabella corrected gently, but without judgment or anger. But he's also my father, and tonight, because of what you did at the Silver Palace, he gets to be just a father, not the boss, not the threat, not the man everyone fears, just a man whose daughter is getting married to someone she loves. The ceremony was beautiful. The reception was better. Dean sang for 3 hours, every request, every dedication, every song that Carmine's wife remembered from their own wedding 40 years earlier. And somewhere around midnight, when the champagne had been flowing for hours and even the bodyguards had loosened their ties, Carmine Falcone pulled Dean aside for a private conversation. I owe you an apology, Carmine said, for how I approached you that night. It was wrong. Forget it. No. I want you to understand something. Carmine's voice was lower now, serious in a way that the party atmosphere couldn't mask. I've spent my whole life making people afraid of me. It was the only way I knew how to survive, how to protect my family, how to build something in a world that wanted to keep men like me down. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that fear isn't the same as respect. You reminded me of that. Remember, this conversation was happening in a corner of a wedding reception, surrounded by people who would never know what was being said, but it would change everything that came after. What are you going to do about it? Dean asked. Carmine smiled. A real smile, tired, but genuine. I'm going to try to be better, not perfect. I'm too old and too set in my ways for perfect, but better. Starting with how I treat the people who work for me, the people who depend on me. He paused. And I'm going to make sure that nobody in this city ever threatens you again. Consider it a wedding gift. Listen, what happened over the next few years would prove that Carmine Falcone was a man of his word. The Vegas entertainment scene, which had always operated under the shadow of organized crime, began to shift. Performers found that their contracts were honored, their safety was guaranteed, their artistic freedom was respected. It wasn't a revolution. The old powers were still there, still controlling much of what happened, but the culture changed, and everyone who knew the story traced it back to that night at the Silver Palace, when Dean Martin did the unthinkable and got away with it. If you want to know what happened years later, when the FBI finally came for Carmine Falcone and he had to decide between his freedom and his principles, tell me in the comments. Some stories don't have endings, just long pauses. Some friendships outlast the circumstances that created them. The Silver Palace was renovated in 1979, renamed and reimagined for a new generation of tourists who had never heard of Carmine Falcone. Isabella and Michael had 3 children, all of whom grew up hearing the story of the night a singer talked back to their grandfather. Carmine himself lived until 1984, long enough to see his empire dismantled by federal prosecutors, but also long enough to watch his grandchildren grow up without having to live in the shadow of the family business. And Dean? He kept singing, kept making people laugh, kept walking onto stages, and turning rooms full of strangers into rooms full of friends. He sang at 2 more Falcone weddings over the years, Isabella's children, when they grew up, and each time he told the story of that first night, of the threat that became a handshake, of the monster who turned out to be a father. When asked about it in interviews, Dean always deflected with a shrug and a wave of his hand. "The guy wanted me to sing at his daughter's wedding," he would say with practiced casualness. "I sang at his daughter's wedding. That's what performers do. That's the whole job, really." But the people who were there that night knew better. They had seen something extraordinary, something that couldn't be reduced to a simple anecdote. They had seen a man refuse to be afraid, refuse to back down, refuse to treat another human being as anything less than human. One moment, one choice, one refusal to let fear dictate the terms of life. That's the story of Dean Martin and the Mafia boss, who came to threaten and stayed to listen. That's what happens when courage meets charisma, when a performer decides that his dignity is worth more than his safety, when the right words at the right moment can change absolutely everything. Remember the Silver Palace. Remember Carmine Falcone. Remember the night when the most dangerous man in Vegas met his match. And ask yourself honestly, if a powerful man threatened you in front of 400 people, would you have the courage to laugh in his face and turn him into a friend? Some questions define who we truly are. Some nights create legends that last forever. This was one of them.